Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We'll make a start as it's 12:02. So, welcome to the Pipeline Industry Guild's um, third webinar. This webinar is covering the regulatory frameworks and related matters. My name is Martin Shannon. I'm head of commercial services within Cadent Gas. This is, as I mentioned, the third in the series of the webinars we've run. We've done skills and competence as the first one, net zero construction as the second one. This is the third in the series, and next one up is innovation. So we are recording this webinar, so if you do not want to be on camera, please keep your cameras turned off, and if we could just ask if cameras are turned off as we go through for bandwidth, and please feel free to put questions in the chat, but we will pick up questions collectively at the end of each session. If I just turn to the agenda slide. Thank you very much. So, as I mentioned, I'm Martin Shannon, Head of Commercial Service Cadent Gas. So I'm going to be talking about the UK hydrogen economy, business models, and also touching on the Track 1 CCS clusters. I'll just hand to my colleague Arab, Jemima.
Hi, thank you, Martin, and good afternoon, everyone. Very pleased to be here. My name's Jemima and I lead CCS globally for Arab, and I'll pass on to my colleague, Sue Gibson. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. Pleased to be here. My name is Sue Gibson. I'm an energy consultant with a focus on heat network zoning and carbon capture and storage. I'll hand over to my colleague, Mike Copson.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Mike. I'm an associate director at Arup. I lead the energy business in northwestern Yorkshire in the UK, with an active interest in hydrogen and all other sustainable low carbon vectors.
Brilliant. Thank you all. So if we move to the first slide, and I'll be first up. And so hydrogen developments and the need for pipelines. If we just move to the next slide. So you're hopefully you're aware who Cadent Gas is. We're the largest distribution gas network in the UK. We've got over 130,000 kilometres of pipes. And one of the big opportunities we have with the hydrogen economy is to start to look to repurpose some of those pipes, so hydrogen for heat, but also build out some new LTS level infrastructure. And that's what we call the Track 1 carbon capture and use projects. One is HyNet, and the other big sister project is East Coast Hydrogen. It is a huge moment for the industry as we look to decarbonise, and we feel that hydrogen, certainly in big power intensive industry, is a real good, strong vector to do so. Move to the next slide. We have been very busy, as you can imagine, very recently. A lot of these projects are very much politically driven. And very recently, we just had Claire Coutinho come in, replacing Grant Shapps. And, you know, as I mentioned, these projects are as much political endeavours as they are financial endeavours. We need to have government really putting their shoulder behind the projects in terms of developing the frameworks and the business models to attract the investors. And Claire Coutinho, she's hit the ground running. Now recently just got signed heads of terms with ENI for the carbon capture and use for the CO2, which is huge. Very strong signal. The government is still very much supported to hit the net zero targets that it's set, even though the political agenda may well change with an election likely in the next sort of 24 months. Next slide, please. One of the things that we have been doing at Cadent with and across the industry with colleagues is developing what we call our thought leadership. You know, really promoting the benefits of hydrogen and making hydrogen accessible and understandable to the communities, both communities at the local level in terms of local LEPs, but also through to big industry. And we run a thing called a Hello Hydrogen publicity campaign recently, and this really embeds, things like job creation, greener, ease and familiarity and affordability, because hydrogen to some people is still, a little bit of an anathema. So we really need to make it accessible and understandable, and very much make sure that people understand that it is a safe vector. Next slide, please. We are progressing the Track 1 CCUS clusters, both HyNet and East Coast, and we've also got similar schemes which we're at the feasibility stage at the moment, which is Capital H and Hydrogen Valleys. The two big ones though, HyNet and East Coast, these are the real ones that are really going to hit the ground running in terms of the CO2 targets that government has set. HyNet is completed its FEED, and it's also just gone through its statutory consultation on the route, and East Coast is moving into FEED as well. It is well into FEED at the moment as well. The big thing for these two projects is the next funding, which is the hydrogen business models, which I'll come on to. Next slide, please. So what do we need to get there? So we need a sort of new commercial regime. So how can we attract the investors to invest in the hydrogen economy? We need regulatory reform. Government has committed through the business plans that the Track 1 clusters are going to go ahead, which is fantastic. But we still need to bring industry together, because the Track 1 clusters are made up of lots of different stakeholders, and choreographing how they all can get to what we call FID, final investment decision, in a choreographed way is one of the key ambitions that we've got. Hydrogen for heat is huge, and it's a real vector that we think can really benefit the economy. We've got the H100 trial in Scotland, which is looking to put in a purpose-built network to convert some homes to hydrogen. And most recently, Redcar has been awarded the Hydrogen Village trials. This is where you're going to repurpose existing gas assets to be pure hydrogen for homes, and that's going to be 2,000 homes that'll be running from 2026, and that will then lead into a policy decision that government's going to make, DESNES, around is hydrogen for heat a credible vector. So there's a lot we still need to do in that space to build the evidence case for government, but we are progressing very well towards that goal, and that hopefully will then give us an opportunity for hydrogen for town. Hydrogen for town is where you're at the start of mass rollout of the hydrogen economy. Next slide, please. So the policy frameworks that have been developed by government to help underpin this new hydrogen economy, there's a number here, as you can see across the timeline. So we've got the production business models. Now those production business models are basically what are going to allow both the blue hydrogen projects, which is taking natural gas through an autothermal reformer, and the electrolytic hydrogen projects get to FID. The cost of hydrogen is more expensive than the input fuel, and that's what these business models will allow. They give a subsidy called a contract for difference, effectively that will subsidise that cost, so that hopefully consumers will pay roughly parity with their current energy costs. So those production business models are moving forward at pace. The electrolytic first round has just is being awarded towards the end of this year, and that allows green electrolytic hydrogen projects to hit the ground running from 2025 onwards. And HyNet HPP1, as we call it, a 350 megawatt autothermal reformer, is also going into detailed dialogue with governments at the moment. So that's the production business models. The transportation and storage business models is what Cadent needs. So we need those business models because that will allow us to have a license condition which will allow us to develop the regulated HyNet network, allow us to borrow the money from investors to build out and recover that over the 45-year term. So we're in very detailed dialogue with government at the moment around the business case and the economic benefit and value that HyNet will give. But government is very stringent at the moment, as we all know. Money is tight, so we are very much focused on demonstrating every pound that we're going to put into HyNet is money well spent. You've also got hydrogen blending. Hydrogen blending has been proven at through HydroPloy. That's where you can take up to 20% hydrogen and put it into the existing gas network with no retrofit. And that's huge because you don't need to retrofit people's homes. Hydrogen blending, there's a minded to position probably going to happen early next year. That will allow hydrogen to be blended into natural gas networks following the evidence and the safety cases that have been developed through the various projects. But blending at the moment isn't supported via a production business model. So there is still that little gap that we need to cross. And then there is the future energy bill, which is going through, and a new entity called the system operator. So the system operator's role is going to be quite a large role going forward, where it's going to sort of stitch together this new energy economy. So how does electrification and hydrogen and solar and wind, how does all that come together in a coherent plan to power the UK through to the 2030s, 40s and 50s? Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the new business model, so it's effectively as a contract for difference. So it's keep it very simple. The input fuel cost is basically it covers the delta between the cost of production and the reference price, which is basically the cost of natural gas as the counterfactual. And effectively, the producers will produce the hydrogen. It will need to meet a certain standard, and that hydrogen will be sold effectively to an off-taker. And then the producer will recover that additional subsidy through the CFD model, and that's underpinned by it's called the Low Carbon Hydrogen Agreement, which is run by the Low Carbon Contracts Company, which is part of DESNZ. Next slide, please. We talk about a lot of colours with hydrogen, blue, turquoise, green, but effectively government now has very helpfully introduced what's called the Low Carbon Hydrogen Standard. So as long as the hydrogen meets the standard at the point of production, point of metering, then it will qualify for the subsidy under the contract for difference, under the Low Carbon Hydrogen Agreement. And this is helpful because it does help move away from blue, which is the autothermal methane reformation, and green, which is electrolysis. So that's quite a helpful move by government to sort of, make it a little bit more agnostic. Next slide, please. We touched on the future system operator, and this new entity, which is going to be appointed by DESNZ through GEMA, and will be effectively an arm of GEMA, will have powers to really control and dictate to a degree how the UK economy is going to develop from its energy piece at the moment, focusing on value, resilience, for the consumers of the UK. It is a very large role, so we're all quite interested to see how it is going to pan out as we move forward in a more decarbonised, but also in more of a decentralised way that we have historically had since the 2060s, 2070s. Next slide, please. So the infrastructure that we need, I've touched on a number of these points already, but that new role where you are looking to power industry through hydrogen, but also hopefully power homes through hydrogen, where we can power homes through hydrogen. One of the things which we do need to focus on is storage. We are quite, low on storage, both at the moment for natural gas, which we use a thing called line pack, but for hydrogen, storage is a key element that we need really to make these systems work. Without storage, you do limit the flexibility of hydrogen because it's harder to compress hydrogen. So storage for HyNet, we are looking at Innoven and salt caverns, about 1.3 terawatt hours a year of storage. But storage at the moment, the business models haven't yet landed on whether that's going to be a regulated storage model or a merchant storage model. So there is still work to do to deliver storage, but storage is central to both HyNet and also East Coast. This slide also brings out the point of resilience. if we are going to roll out hydrogen to towns, we need to be resilient, right? The natural gas network is about 99.999% resilient. In the early days where you've got hydrogen production, a bit more fragmented, that resilience is going to be key. Next slide, please. So the underpinning regulation will evolve, and ultimately, with what we're looking at here is we're looking at a very much a subsidised model to start with. We are still at the very early stages of designing what the hydrogen code is going to look like. For the natural gas network, at the moment we have a uniform network code with about 700 mods in that. Is that the right approach to go down? I think there's parts of network code that will certainly help us, but that model and that regulation is going to have to evolve over time so that we move very much, hopefully, to a non-subsidised hydrogen economy. The other point is the model for industry is very much quite simple in the early days, because it's going to be a producer selling bilaterally to an off-taker, and Cadent will basically be the system operator. And that's quite a simple model when you've only got one or two producers. Where you move to a much more integrated model, you are going to have metering after the day allocation effectively, so that everybody gets the hydrogen they need. But the regulation is something that the teams are working on quite hard at the moment. And the CO2 business models and regulatory is a little bit ahead at the moment of where we are with hydrogen. Next slide, please. So the cost of hydrogen in terms of its production cost. So electrolytic hydrogen is more expensive at the moment, but over time we see that falling, and then that cost of blue hydrogen, driven by the counterfactual of natural gas, gas prices will probably remain where they are, or if not, rise in terms of times of crisis. But over time, we do see the future hydrogen costs falling over time, which is good. As you have more offshore wind, larger electrolytic projects come on board. That is the general trajectory, and over time, electrolytic hydrogen we think will far outstrip blue hydrogen, which is, we need blue hydrogen to start with to get the market. But over time, we see that sort of moving that trajectory. Next slide, please. The HyNet, as we are choreographing at the moment, with government to get to FID. So we need production to get to FID, which is Vertex, now EET. We need E&I to get to FID, which is the red pipeline. And we also we need ourselves to get to FID as well, because this has to have a whole system approach. But it's hugely supported, as you can see from all the logos on the right hand side, and also all the commitment we've got from the CO2 capture on site that's going to go directly into the E&I pipeline. But taking FID is going to be a challenge, and this is partly where the FSO is going to have to support, and government's going to have to support, because there's different stakeholders, different investment risk. How does it all come together as a coherent plan? That's the challenge we're working through at the moment. Next slide, please. So we haven't even built HyNet yet, and government is always on the front foot. So there was also now the Track 1 expansion process, which is already launched, which is looking for more CO2 projects to come forward to get funding to join and capture their CO2. And one of the big ones for us, for Cadent, is the HPP2, as we call it, and that's 1,000 megawatt blue hydrogen production plant, and that's going to be the real driver behind the HyNet model. And it's going to really drive out that 124 kilometers and flood that with hydrogen for the off takers on the previous slide. But there's another, as you can see from the slide, there's a number of use cases for those projects. So if you've got projects, now is the time to put them forward into that Track 1 expansion process. Next slide, please. HyNet is going through its statutory consultation. So on the left-hand side is the routing corridor that we have anchored, and that's 124 kilometres. And then on the right-hand side, it basically shows you the boundaries that we've got, where we've been out, talked to hundreds of stakeholders, and we're looking hopefully to submit that planning application in March 2024. And it's basically about a 12 to 14 month period where that will get evaluated by the planning inspectorate, and subject to any judicial reviews, we hopefully will get that granted, and that will then allow us to build out the backbone system. Next slide, please. So for those sort of engineers on the call, you can see some of the metadata there in terms of what we're doing in terms of the HyNet pipeline. We are making it scalable, as you can imagine. So we're going to be able to run it at a lower bar and then increase that pressure over time, because HyNet phase 2, which is the 124 kilometres, will go into what we call HyNet phase 3. So obviously it makes sense to use the right materials with the right pressures for the period now, but allow us to scale up so we don't have to lay new pipeline in the future. And that's the philosophy which Ofgem and also our engineers think is the right way forward, and it also minimises the disruption to the landscape as well. Next slide, please. And I think this is my last slide. So this slide basically just shows you some of the metadata for, as I mentioned, for the engineers. So it's 44 bar running up to 75 bar. The design pressure is an 80 bar system. We're using X65 high stress pipeline, which is thinner, which is what we need. We are using I think X50, where we're going into tunnels and railway crossings, of which there's a lot. And interestingly, the gas will also have to be odorized as well. So it's going to be the same odorized as the smell of natural gas. And also we do need that thing, as I mentioned earlier, storage. I think that was my last slide. Oh no, just the very final slide. So these are just some of the key points which are coming up. Decision on hydrogen blending. It's actually gone back a little bit now. We don't think it's going to be the end of the year. It's going to be 2024. And the key one, obviously, for us is the transportation storage business model, which is in 2025. That's going to give us the access for the funding, hopefully, so we can build out the HyNet network and get HyNet commissioned by back end of this decade, by 2028. And if it's a positive decision, hydrogen for heat, hydrogen in town from 2030 onwards. Thank you. I think I'm now going to be handing over to Jemima.
Thanks, Martin. And great to hear so much exciting progress from the kind of macro strategic picture down to the metadata on the pipelines. It's brilliant to see hydrogen going so rapidly and having come so far in the UK, and that we're now at an exciting point as we are with CCS, where we're into metadata on pipelines, into safety considerations, and coming into construction phases. So it's really exciting talking about FID being about to happen in HyNet in particular, where of course the head of terms was signed just last week as well for that project. So real momentum on CCS. Again, grateful for this opportunity. CCS is carbon capture and storage is a real passion for me. It is personal, and I wanted to just mention going into this, and conscious of time, we will be brief, I think, in the next couple of presentations, so that we've got time for questions. But I wanted to just make the personal sort of point on the top. I think whether or not you've got children, climate change is becoming something that troubles us all, and this is something, the CCS infrastructure and the construction of it, that is really something we can all do something about now. It's got cross-party consensus and has a growing amount of momentum in the UK, and as we'll see in the next few slides, that's really reflecting an international picture. So if we press on, Sue, Martin outlined there in terms of the role of blue hydrogen in the growing hydrogen economy. Of course, that blue hydrogen, if you notice from his colour explanations, does require CCS. So CCS is the process by which we capture the CO2 from industrial processes, including the creation of hydrogen from methane in the blue process, or indeed other industrial and power processes. And so what CCS enables us to do is to decarbonize our existing infrastructure, our existing power, our existing industry. It is, for that reason, the no-brainer of climate change, and this is what it's increasingly recognised as in the UK and internationally. So there's some really exciting momentum behind this. So this is the basic process: capture from your flue in your industrial source of emissions, transport, of course, that involves compression and purification often, and then shipping to or pipeline to a storage which is offshore. And of course, in the UK, we have the benefit of a historical industry which represents infrastructure, it represents skills, and it represents knowledge around safe delivery and storage of gases in the subsurface of the North Sea. So we're in the position in the UK to serve the need of storing emissions for ourselves in the UK, and of course our European neighbours, and potentially further afield as well. So if we could press on, Sue, thanks. So the purple line here is the CCS bit. This is an IEA, International Energy Agency graph. Again, just making the point that alongside hydrogen, alongside things like reduced demand, electrification, CCS is a really fundamental part of the journey to net zero. And there's a quote there from Al Gore, who's one of the champions and poster boys, I think he wouldn't mind saying, of climate change. And he talks about stopping using the sky as an open sewer. And of course, it's also our historic emissions. Unfortunately, since Victorian times, thereabouts, we've been doing just that. So CCS is the technology which enables us to deal with our current emissions and also to start to address those historic emissions too, to really get the bathtub plugged up and then start to deal with the contents of the bathtub as well. So carrying on, please. Often people ask questions about the technology. Is it ready? Is it tested? So the fact is it is. One of the oldest projects on CCS storage is an onshore one in the Algerian Sahara in Salah. So they've been injecting CO2 in onshore former gas reservoirs since 2004. So coming up for 20 years, and have lots of learning there around the types of storage and the safety and the retention in those permanent stores, which have indeed proved to be permanent. Gorgon in Western Australia has had a lot of learnings, also been actively storing CO2 for a long time, using different methods and having different learnings, in that case involving the water as a factor around those offshore stores, again depleted gas reservoirs. And then Northern Lights, which is one of the most exciting European projects in offshore Norway, where we're rapidly learning again about the nature of those stores and also the associated infrastructure, which is increasingly in place, and they're looking at both ship and pipeline import. You can see a picture from South Korean shipyard, Goji Island, where actually the second keel has now been laid for a ship to transport CO2 to the Northern Lights facility. And the graph on the top right-hand corner there just gives you a sense of the momentum in terms of investment in CCS projects around the world. There's been a real step up. So we're really riding a tide here, and there's no one more central to the delivery of these projects than the pipeline sector. So it's really key to get involved in the deployment of this infrastructure now. So if we could press on, thank you, Sue. Just wanted to make here the point of the UK, the opportunity for the UK. So there's an image there on the left-hand side from the North Sea Transition Authority, the NSTA, just giving an indication of some of the size and locations of potential carbon dioxide stores. Of course, not unconnected to where the emissions are. That central image we've all seen before, I think, working in energy transition in the UK. And of course, there are some huge industrial hubs, and that's the advantage of where we are in the UK. We have a hub-based development where we're looking at both hydrogen and CCS deployment, and those are conveniently located, often close to these offshore stores. So the infrastructure is moving together and advancing well. So there's some numbers there reflecting the fundamental role of carbon capture and storage to the decarbonisation of those hubs. And of course, we're part of a wider ecosystem too, and there are lots of similar hubs of emissions in the not too distant regions around our North Sea geology. So yeah, thanks, Sue. Martin already talked a bit about the tracks, so I won't dwell on this, but of course in CCS we've seen some exciting recent announcement. The Chancellor committed 20 billion, which is an enormous amount in the global context in terms of investment in CCS. He committed that in April this year. And moving forward, they've made a further announcement of additional stores for CCS around in the North Sea, southern North Sea, and in Scotland only a few weeks ago. So funding is continuing to advance, and we're expecting some further announcements in the autumn statement for CCS, particularly for the supply chain. So do keep an eye out for that. That's in November from the government. So pressing on, thanks, Sue. What I wanted to talk about here was simply the range of activities involved in the creation of what is an entirely new infrastructure system. So from policy and regulation that we're talking about today, through, of course, feasibility, FEED, detailed design, construction, we're all familiar with that sort of process route for a project stage gate route. But then, of course, within the CCS system, we're talking about the capture plants, like in the HyNet example, that's in a cement context. There are lots of different types of capture technologies. Amine based is the usual, but that is evolving, and it comes with a whole associated set of infrastructure. And the right way through transport, of course, pipeline transport, sometimes repurposing, and other times new pipelines are used. And through, obviously, utilization is sometimes an option for the CO2, and through to that permanent storage. And of course, there are interfaces there with things like the wastewater and the water system, with our ports, with our transport systems, and of course with hydrogen. Thanks, Sue. So in summary, it is a whole new infrastructure system, and it absolutely calls upon all of us to get involved and help to accelerate that development. And it's also a massive opportunity for our sector. There's a huge opportunity for the supply chain. As I say, look out for announcements coming up in later this autumn. We are looking at things right from construction and planning and repurposing or development of new pipelines, all the way through to the development of those regulatory models that are also in progress for hydrogen, and association with things like power generation, to understand how these mechanisms, how this infrastructure is going to be funded and developed. But those things are well underway at this point. I think that's the last slide. Is that right, Sue? Oh, fine. And finally, there is this was a report which I and some colleagues from Arup led earlier this year, and this report is available on the gov.uk website. If you Google a remarkable new infrastructure or economic opportunities in CCS, it will come up. And what it points to is not just in construction, EPCs, but also in pipeline manufacture and import, assembly of column vessels. There's a huge range of opportunities for involvement in the development of this infrastructure system from our sector. So thank you very much for your time. And I'll pass on to, I think, Sue, who's going to talk to us about heat networks. Thank you.
Thank you, Jemima. And thank you for the opportunity to give you a little bit of an update on what's happening with regard to heat networks and heat network zones. So I'm not familiar, I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the idea of a heat network, so I'm just going to start with some thoughts about what a heat network is. If you think about how you're going to decarbonise heat in buildings, apart from gas, where do we go? So there are plenty of renewable sources of heat, but the average household or the average building owner wouldn't know how to exploit them. So a heat network and heat networks have existed for a long time at a communal scale, but a district heat network is a means of sharing that renewable energy through a heat distribution pipework and allowing an energy centre to deal with the difficulties of how you integrate that renewable or low carbon heat. So, as I mentioned, heat networks have been developed in the UK for a long time, and they exploit a variety of low carbon heat sources. One of those future heat sources could indeed be low carbon hydrogen. Other examples are deep geothermal heat, shallow geothermal heat, water heat sources, waste heat from industry, and an example would be a waste incineration plant. So there is a great deal of government support for this. It has been going on since at least 2008, and there's some really super resources which give you an indication of what the investment pipeline is and where the opportunities are. And I've just put a couple of links here for you to explore at a later date, should you wish to do that. So how do we and why do we want heat networks? Well, the Committee on Climate Change in their 6th carbon budget agreed that as part of our transition to a low carbon future, we needed heat networks as a means of decarbonising heat in buildings. And they estimated, and also the Energy Systems Catapult and a few others, somewhere between 17 and 20% of heat in buildings should be delivered by heat networks, according to these future energy scenarios. And that would look like something like 95 terawatt hours of heat and 28 gigawatts of heat production. This has a big contribution to net zero, about equivalent to maybe one of those industrial sectors that Jemima and Martin have talked about, enabling us to save over 13 million tonnes of CO2 by harnessing those waste heat and renewable heat sources. A significant amount of investment is needed to deliver that, an estimated 60 to 80 billion by 2050, which is a large increase. So, Arup has been involved in heat network development for a long time and helped develop some of the early guidance on how to go about doing that for governments. So naturally, they reached to us when they were thinking about how to take heat network development and deployment at a faster rate, and moving from a penetration as it is today of about 2 to 3% of heat being delivered through heat networks to wanting to get to 20% is quite a significant thing. So they engaged with industry to try and understand what were the problems. They engaged with local government to understand what the problems were. And they've decided on an approach called heat network zoning. And it's aimed at removing the barriers and accelerating delivery, as we said. There are major changes in policy coming along in the energy bill, which Martin referred to, also very important for this policy. And some of the things that are going on in government are defining the policy in great detail, consultations, and adoption of technology to help with identifying where heat networks ought to be situated. So in 2020, we were involved in ongoing projects and testing how you would decarbonise a whole city, developing policy consultation. And for the last 2 years, we've been working on a heat network zoning pilot in 28 cities to try and work out what the policy ought to be, how the processes would work, and different ways of defining what a heat network zone should be, and how the government should plan to implement a heat network zone policy. And in the future, we're about to have another consultation on heat network zones. We're anticipating powers being in law. The energy bill is very close to being in law now. And we're then expecting a phased rollout of heat network zoning in up to 200 towns and cities across England. Scotland has already got a process in place. It's a little bit further ahead than in Wales. The heat network zoning policy has significant implications for building owners and great opportunities for the pipeline industry to develop new infrastructure. Like hydrogen and carbon capture and storage, heat network zones will heat networks in zones will have a regulator in the form of Ofgem. So you can see quite a few things coalescing with Ofgem to try and have an overview of these future energy policies. So the take-up is quite important. Some of the things that heat network zoning policy is starting to come to terms with in terms of what it needs to deliver is some sort of central authority that is going to define the heat network zones. Zoning coordinators who have local responsibility for zones, zone developers who may get the chance to develop one or more zones or part of a zone, the heat networks within it, and Ofgem as the regulator. To make the rollout of heat networks faster, it's proposed that heat networks will get permitted developer status, making them more like other utilities. There are protections in place for consumers by which we mean billing and metering has to be fully implemented, and there are technical standards for the delivery of the network, of metering, and of customer services. To make the acceleration happen, we are expecting that there will be obligations placed on heat sources and heat off-takers, and that would be in the area of providing data about energy usage and connection to a heat network. And there might be an opportunity for development exclusivity within a zone for a heat network zone developer. For existing heat networks, and there are many in the ground, there is also a push for decarbonisation plans and to make the networks as efficient as possible. Just a final point, there are some examples of heat networks in the ground, and I wanted to give you a very brief heads up about some of the sizes. So there are about 16 kilometres of heat networks for instance, the Enfield heat network in London. Existing heat networks in Manchester might be about 2 kilometres. An existing heat network in Leeds is about, I beg your pardon, Leeds is 16 and Enfield is about 9. And these are heat networks where there are existing heat networks or planned heat networks, and their information is in the public domain. And don't forget to have a look at those pipeline links that I gave you as well, which give you more information. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Mike Cobson.
Thanks, Sue. I'm going to be very quick because I want to make sure that we've got enough time for questions. Sue, could you move on to the next slide, please? I'm just going to pick up on a few points that have been made actually across the presentations. The one thing that the UK has is a wonderful pipeline infrastructure that can be used and should be used for the energy transition. We're very agnostic about technology, and at Arup I think we realised that it's an and conversation rather than an either or conversation. So hydrogen we see very much as a part of the energy transition. We were one of the first to sign up for the World Energy Council letter of voluntary commitment. There's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be able to position ourselves, because time is actually our biggest constraint, I think, at the moment, rather than the finance and the knowledge. to really implement a hydrogen economy at scale, and pipelines, both for domestic use and also for an export medium, is a fantastic opportunity. And as Jemima rightly pointed out as well, we have the new infrastructure of carbon capture that we should be able to that we should be utilizing. Can we have the next slide, please, Sue? I just wanted to show this map to you. This is a go that we had of an integrated UK-wide hydrogen map in terms of demand across industry, mobility, and domestic gas use. So you'll see the red spots are where there are centres of demand, and the yellow blob actually is a very high centre of demand for gas demand for domestic use in London, which relies very, very heavily on the gas network. So it's interesting that there's a lot of discussion around heat pumps versus hydrogen. Of course, we need to be wrapping our arms around both, frankly, to make sure that we can get to that net zero target. One thing that I've learned in my time in sustainability and energy transition is that chasing silver bullets is actually quite a big effort, and what we should be doing is looking actually what's applicable to the geography, the industry, and the consumers, and what they need in terms of their own their own energy requirements. Can we go on to the next slide, please, Sue? I wanted to highlight international work as well. In terms of California, the UK's got a fantastic gas network that's very, very well mature. And when I've looked at other countries around the world, we can see that other countries are going through their energy transitions at different paces. And that's driven by their own infrastructure that they have on the ground as a legacy. If we look at Southern California, they've also looked at converting their gas network. And I think my point here is that we should probably lean into other international studies to see what actually works and what doesn't. Let's just not isolate ourselves and say, well, this is what's going to work for the UK. Another good example, I think, is work that's been done in the Netherlands already, where hydrogen boilers are running in households. There are pros and cons of what they've done there. And I think some folks might look at the safety case and say, that's not quite to what we need. But the fact is I think there's best practice that we can pull around the world, and we shouldn't be afraid of it not being invented in our backyard. But it shows that others are going at pace as well in terms of doing similar projects to ensure their energy security and also to make sure that they're meeting their net zero commitments. Let's go to the next slide, please, Sue. This is just a quick one to reinforce what Jemima said. Arup's done quite a lot of work in terms of thought leadership and also publication. So if you go to the Arup website, you'll be able to find quite a few pieces on hydrogen as part of the overall ecosystem for net zero by 2050 and how that fits in. Quite an interesting read. If you get a chance, do have a look. I think what I'm going to do is stop there so that we've got enough time for questions from the presenters for doing a fabulous job. And yeah, we'll look forward to questions as they come through, both on the chat and if you just want to ask them directly. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Are there any questions?
There's a few in the chat, Martin. You might want to go through those first, maybe.
Oh, unfortunately, I can't see the chat, Mike, unfortunately, from where I am.
Apologies, guys. I'm just trying to struggling with my controls to get to the questions. So let me just scroll back up. May I just read out questions, and if you want to turn your microphone on and add to the question before we answer, then that's most welcome. So Alexander Herridge asked, does the low carbon hydrogen standards CO2 level prohibit the use of non-CCS blue hydrogen? Does the hydrogen standard prohibit the use of non-CCS hydrogen? I think is the answer, because I think blue, it wouldn't be called blue hydrogen if it was non-CCS, would it?
No, it wouldn't. So the low carbon standard, it covers scope 1, scope 2, and up to some scope 3 emissions. And the low carbon hydrogen standard obviously covers blue hydrogen, which is CCUS, and it also covers electrolytic hydrogen as well. And that's all the way, as I mentioned, up through those different emissions. So we can drop out to the group the wider definition on what's in that specific standard, but it's a very helpful standard for industry and investors to get their heads around.
Thank you. I hope that answers your question, Alexander. Bill Latteridge asked, have the fire services and emergency responders agreed to have the odorization of hydrogen the same smell as gas?
That's a great question. So so the HSE, yes, they're, as always, they're and under GSMR, they're minded to obviously recognising that the existing gas network below 7 bar is odorised. So with these electrolytic projects coming on board, at the moment, rather oddly, they don't need to be odorised. So if you're an onshore producer giving it to an offtake, going down a carriageway, at the moment, the regs say you don't need to odorise that gas. But the HSE recognise that as a gap in legislation. So they are looking to odorise everything below 7 bar, and also the high net track 1 clusters, they will be odorised by the distribution networks, which is different from NTS, which isn't odorised. So gas that comes down the national transmission system isn't odorised, but we are going to be odorising hydrogen, is the position at the moment, and it will smell the same. It will smell the same.
Because am I right in thinking, Martin, we rely on the public response to identify gas leaks quite often. It's a key part of the response, and therefore the odorisation is an essential part of safety. Is that right?
It's a key part. It's a key part of the safety case for the gas transporters. So I look after the emergency gas response service as well, the 0800 number. So public reported escapes by members of the public. They recognise the smell of gas. They call us into the 0800, and we send out an engineer in 1 or 2 hours, controlled or uncontrolled. Our engineers are going to have to be hydrogen ready, so that they recognise on their maps it's a hydrogen pipeline that could have been interfered with, and take the appropriate steps and follow their risk procedures in dealing with hydrogen as it would with natural gas. So it will be as safe as natural gas is today.
Thank you, Martin. I've got a question from Phil Croft, which Jemima has started to respond to as well, but I'll just share this link first, and just say the question is, do reports like this hijack the progress of hydrogen? Sorry, beg your pardon. Do reports like this hijack the progress of hydrogen investments? They're basically saying electrification of home heat, including grid upgrade, is the cheapest way to go for the majority. And Phil, I notice you switched your camera on. I don't know whether you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to help you with the question. Yeah,
I was struggling with multiple screens then. Sorry.
So yeah, I mean, you captured the essence of it. It's a huge report with a lot of economic analysis in it, but basically in a strap line, what they're saying is electrification of home heat is the answer in the vast majority of cases. It's way cheaper to do that and upgrade the distribution system, which is significant, it's cheaper to do that than go down a hydrogen route, which will also take some upgrade of the system, slightly larger pipes, etc. That's their thesis anyway. That's what they're saying. So
Jemima,
I just wondered, it's not helpful, is it, when we're talking about trying to get these projects away and get them going, when you've got fairly senior people and recognised bodies putting out reports like this?
Yeah, Phil, you're absolutely right. I think, focusing on just one topic is probably not giving the whole picture. Just to lean into Martin's point around storage, the estimates for hydrogen storage are around 100 terawatt hours, of which at the moment we only have about 3 commissioned. So, we need to make sure that we've got that buffer, that backup, to make sure that we can keep the lights on and our homes warm. One depleted oil field will give you around 50 terawatt hours, and the UK's got prime real estate to be able to do that. So I think it's about looking at that holistic picture of what is the energy storage requirements. Gas is normally 6 to 7 times the demand of electric. We've seen historically, when we had the beast from the east, momentarily it was 18 times. Given the inconsistencies that we're seeing with our weather patterns, we need to essentially future proof the infrastructure, and in my view, not just look at the economics.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to respond, or shall we move on? Okay. So the next question was from Shane Longworth. Has government policy on delaying the phase out of gas boilers had any impact, positive or negative, on the journey to hydrogen?
I could pick up something on that if that's helpful. Mike, were you going to come in?
I was just going to use an analogy to mobility, actually, where the phase out of internal combustion engines has been kicked out a little bit, but I don't see any downturn in the shift towards electrification within the mobility sector. So maybe I'm being a bit naive by saying that, because gas boilers are a very different thing to the cars that you drive. I think, I'd love to hear Martin's view on this, but I wonder if there's a bigger picture at play, especially in the mobility sector, where you've got certain folks lobbying for the continuation of internal combustion. I know certainly the adoption of hydrogen within mobility is a longer term play that's more suited to heavy duty, and therefore you may need, for want of a better word, stay of execution for internal combustion whilst that technology ramps up. But in terms of gas boilers, I'm not au fait with how the technology compares, how transparent it is. So Martin, I'll shut up there before I dig a bigger hole.
No, certainly. I think genuinely, we are underestimating how quickly we can move to this electrified economy, and I think there is a realization in government that gas, be it hydrogen, be it natural gas with hydrogen blend, will play its role for, frankly, decades to come. And manufacturers are producing hydrogen-ready boilers at the moment, so it's not a technology barrier; it's a barrier. What we need is the product, which is hydrogen produced at scale, to be able to get that into the mix. And electrification of everyone's homes through heat pumps. Heat pumps don't work in everybody's homes. In terraces, it's quite difficult to get heat pumps in. So having a mixed portfolio of bullets at this point, I think, is the right approach, rather than simply going down a whole electrification route.
And then just finally on that, I was just saying, we had Chris Gidmore came and spoke in our offices a little while ago, and he talked about this green hushing, which refers to civil servants in DESNZ progressing with the journey towards net zero, including hydrogen and CCS, while irrespective of politicians, if you like, with the greatest respect. And we are going into an election period now, and whether it's May or September next year, we're going to hear a lot more of loud positioning on lots of different angles, and politicians needing to respond to their various bases. But with a bit of luck, we're going to continue to progress aligned with our legal commitments to net zero, and we'll see a steady trickle of positive announcements underneath or alongside that positioning. So I think keeping heads down and focus is key at this point. And
I totally agree with what you're saying there, Jemima.
Yeah.
I totally agree with what you're saying there, and my experience working with governments is that they're just getting on with it. They're doing all of the really hard work that is required to establish what are new sectors, deserving government intervention in the market to help those new sectors grow and reach their potential. And it's a natural thing that an established sector such as electricity has a bit of a natural advantage and is pushing.
Yeah, I'd agree with that as well. And I think just for context, the existing gas network on an annual basis, I think carries over 3 times the annual energy that the electricity network does. So how can you suddenly upscale the electricity network by from where we are today to convey that in the near term? It's not really feasible, is it? So having hydrogen or natural gas and using that as a battery, because gas, it can store energy, electrical renewable energy, where you keep the load factor high on the wind turbine on a windy day. Don't send it to the grid. You send it to produce hydrogen, forms a battery, and then take it back into to electricity at a later date. You lose energy in that mix, but it's better than having that wind turbine not turning. Any more questions, Sue?
I think that's we've got to the end of the questions. Thank you. And we are pretty much at time as well. So
I just thank you everybody for joining this webinar. It is recorded, and please reach out to myself or the team if you've got any questions you want to speak bilaterally with us. And we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, which I think is innovation. Thank you and have a good day.
Thanks all. Bye bye. Thanks, Martin. Bye.